Germany we have a saying, every time you have to go somewhere it keeps you slim, you know, because people often forget. Okay, so welcome everybody. Let's go a little bit backwards. So my name is André Zamaitat, and as you can probably hear from my dialect, I'm from Germany. I'm a reader in psychology, and my area of expertise basically is cognitive psychology, and my really area of personal research interest is multitasking. So we're really speaking about my area today, and I want to give a very brief introduction into cognitive psychology, because in level 1 a lot of students actually don't know exactly what cognitive psychology is. Can you please raise your hand if you think you know what cognitive psychology is? Okay. Who thinks, okay, 1 or 2 hands, yeah, that isn't too much. Who knows what psychology is? Okay, 1 person knows what psychology is after you studied nearly a year psychology at a university, yes? So again, who knows what psychology is? At least 30%, okay, really. We can make advertisement with that on our homepage. After 6 months of studying, 30% of our students knew about what they were studying. Okay, so now we turn to multitasking, speak a bit about cognitive models, and then we go into quite a bit of detail today, which may be a little bit challenging at sometimes, but it's very illustrating for what cognitive psychology is and how it's working. And then we turn a little bit more into something hopefully more entertaining, and that is some research on the notion that there are gender effects in multitasking. Okay, so I just said already we use Poll Everywhere today, so you just enter this link pollf.com/ and then my name, slightly cut off at the end, 568, and if I tell you, then there will be the things coming up. Okay, so the 30% of people who know what psychology is. Who thinks they know what psychology is? Oh no, I actually prepared a Poll Everywhere question for that. So let's start with that. Please enter on Poll Everywhere what a definition of psychology. You know, suppose you're sitting in a job interview, and which has not directly something to do with psychology, and your potentially future employer asks you, well, psychology, what is that anyway? What would you tell them in 1 sentence as a definition? At the moment, the results are not shown, not that you can do that, but I will make them visible in a moment, and then we can have a quick look. Okay, so far 15 people, let's have a look. What? Study of mind and behavior, probably mind and not minutes. Understanding the mind and brain functions as well as human behavior. It's a study of human behavior. Study of the brain. Interaction between the human mind and behavior. Well, most of you, study of the brain, go into the right direction, and it basically is the study of the human mind and behavior. However, cognitive psychology in its purest hardcore form, let's say, does not care about the brain or how it's implemented in the human body. They only care about theoretical models of the mind and not whether they are physiologically plausible or not. That has changed in the recent years with the advent of like functional brain imaging, and now there we have this this bridging area of cognitive neuroscience, and this area looks specifically at linking cognitive psychology with neuroscience. Okay, so actually not too bad, so we can be proud of ourselves, I guess. Okay, let me just quickly check to that. So it's a study of mental processes, which you can say is the mind, and behavior. Okay, so what's cognitive psychology then? Cognitive psychology is the study of mental processes. So from that definition, you can see that cognitive psychology really is a very, very central and core element of psychology in general. And these mental processes are, for instance, attention, learning and memory, language, emotions, problem solving, things like that. Perception. And next year, you will have the cognitive psychology lecture, and then we will go through all of these processes in quite a bit of detail. Okay. And because cognitive psychology is so central, it really is very strongly interwoven with virtually any other area in psychology, like social psychology, clinical, developmental, forensic, things like that. So for instance, if you think about forensic psychology, eyewitness testimony. How reliable is an eyewitness? Such a question is basically cognitive psychology about the performance of our memory system. So even if you don't have a direct interest in cognitive psychology, it's good to have a solid basic knowledge of that. Okay, let's have an introduction into multitasking, and I have a little clip from YouTube, which is from the Ellen DeGeneres show, which is like a comedy show in the US, and it touches upon a couple of concepts we are dealing with today as well. I hope the sound is working.
I have a question for you. Do you think you're multitaskers? Do you consider yourself multitaskers, anybody? Multitasker, I'll tell you right now, I'm talking to you, but I'm also counting my buttons. You didn't know that? Seems like everybody now multitasks. I took a picture of, here's this, Betsy is her name. She works here, and she runs our teleprompter. She's in the control room, and sorry, Betsy, I know you don't like this, but I took a picture. This is how many things she's doing at once. Let's take a look. She's on the phone. She's on the computer. She has another computer on standby, probably on eBay looking for a vintage xylophone or pie cruster, I don't know what she's doing. And you can't see it in the picture, but her foot is making homemade jam. You know what she's not doing in this photo? Working a teleprompter. That's what she's not doing. Betsy is not the only one doing this. I just read a study that said most Americans multitask while they watch TV. I read this when I was getting a massage, and I'll tell you something. I can't believe it. 60% of the people that are watching TV, they surf the web while they're watching TV. The whole point of TV used to be to sit down and relax, and now everyone has to do something while they're doing nothing. And quite frankly, I think it's rude to not pay attention to what's on TV. I'm not just saying because I'm on TV. Okay, I am, but still. Most TV shows need all of your attention or you're going to miss something very important. Sunday night, I was watching Revenge, and I bent down for 2 seconds. Yes, Revenge, right? Yeah. I know. What's going on now? It's crazy. Anyway, so I'm watching Revenge, and I bent down like for 2 seconds to pet my dog. I looked back up. Every character was crying about donuts. And I was so confused, and I realized I accidentally hit the remote and switched to channel The Biggest Loser. Familiar. Anyway, you have to pay attention. Apparently people do all sorts of things when they're watching TV. They text, they email, they clean their houses, they take care of their babies. It's obnoxious. And I come out here every day, I give you 100%. And if I'm going to do that, all I ask of you, my viewers, is to give me 100% back. That's all I ask. And I mean, can you imagine if I came out here and I just started texting while you just sit there, you make a point to watch me, right? And I come out here and I start talking to you, and then after I talk to you for a second, I just... What are you doing? I'm just entertaining millions and millions of people, not penguins, people. clumsy nosy. Okay. Let me just check my Facebook and Twitter. That's hilarious! I'm gonna retweet that. That's funny. See what I'm talking about? That's annoying, right? You're trying to, I'm doing this. Hey, is that cat here? I'm sorry, one second. It's crazy that we have cat hair here. It's floor, it's filthy, filthy dirty. It's okay, it's okay. It's alright. I know. Anyway, what I was saying is we need to stop doing everything at once. We should just focus on one thing. Right now, I'm going to focus on dancing.
Okay, so there were quite a few things in there she mentioned and touched upon, which we'll cover today. One of the things in the beginning she mentioned, I want to say just here, is that a lot of people actually do something else by watching TV. And there was a recent study a few years ago which created a new concept, and they called it like media multitasking. So when you engage in one form of media, whether you engage in other forms of media as well. And it's not necessarily a causal relationship, but what they found is that people who engage very strongly in media multitasking are actually very poor at real multitasking when you do proper tasks with that, and are slightly lower on working memory performance and things like that. Okay, so multitasking. Some more examples. We all know that: cooking, looking up something there. We actually had this already in this sketch right now. Household, taking care of that. It's quite intense. Men, of course, do multitasking as well. That's probably one of the biggest examples, like doing something while driving. And of course, I would never recommend doing that. And after today's lecture, you hopefully see why that is a very, very bad idea to do. And yeah, that probably is the man's dream of multitasking. Okay, so when we speak about this term, we usually start off with a definition or clarification of what we are speaking about. So what is multitasking? And basically it is doing two or more things at the same time. However, now already it becomes not really clear, because what does at the same time exactly mean? And there seems to be a bit of different opinions in the general public, among researchers and so forth. And it turned out that it can actually be two different things. One thing could be really at the same time, fully in parallel. And an example would be phoning while driving. So it's fully overlapping. However, often people would use exactly the same words when they refer to a situation where you quickly have to switch between trials. So suppose you sit in your office, or you try to work, you start an email, the phone rings, you do the phone call, you pick up the phone, put the phone down, then you continue writing your email, and that maybe go on like this. So people would say both cases are multitasking, and you have to do things at the same time. However, it's actually a slight difference between whether we really do something in parallel, so this is time, and this is how we engage in the different tasks indicated by the colors, or whether we quickly switch between them. And we could see that on a different level of time scale, and we can say, yeah, this is the email example down here, and this is driving while phoning. But we can also say, okay, maybe this is the case on a very short time frame, what happens in our brain, in our mind, that even if we think we do something fully in parallel, like phoning while driving, our mind might switch very rapidly between these tasks. Let's say 50 milliseconds on one task, then switching to the next task. So this is another question research is looking at, what happens here. I wanted today present some of the data actually to undergraduate students from Brunel 2 years ago, did their project on, and then we published the data. And the first thing I would like to present is we just presented participants with a lot of activities, and they had to say whether they think this is a very good or prototypical example of multitasking or not. And these are the top activities, and it really boils down to this thing of, okay, two things at the same time. Feeding a toddler and talking on the phone is leading the list, and then second one is talking on the phone while driving when you have to use your mobile phone. What's quite interesting is, as you may know, this is not allowed by law. So you would be fined if you get caught by this. However, it is allowed if you use a hands-free set. But this is actually quite up here as well, here, talking on the phone while driving. So we cut off here. It's still a high value. So people have the idea that even if you don't have to use your hands, you have to engage in multitasking if you speak on the phone while you're driving. And this is in line with research showing that except for that you only have one hand free, the biggest challenge is actually the communication with the other person and actually not having the phone itself. So the distraction for the driving is here still very high. And strictly speaking, that should be forbidden as well. And then we are very down on the list. The bottom is something exercising, then showering, making a sandwich, getting dressed, then going to work. So if it's a larger sequence of things, then you see people do not think that's multitasking. So it's doing two or more things at the same time. And the question now is, what are these things exactly? Can it be any two things, or has to be there some specificity to it? And for instance, think about yourself when you walk and chew gum at the same time. Most people probably wouldn't say that is multitasking. Or when you're watching TV and you switch channels by pressing a button. Again, most people wouldn't say that is multitasking. So what are these things which we have to do at the same time to consider it multitasking? And one key thing here seems to be that these things require some attention. So it's not automatic, like walking, for instance, or chewing gum. And when two or more of these things which require attention, then we get into problems. And if we look at the term multitasking, this also gives already something away. We need to look at proper tasks. That means something where we have a goal to achieve, and we need to show some behavior to get to that goal. So not sheer movement of something, like wiggling one arm and another arm or something. That's not a task. Okay, so let's look at this notion of controlled versus automatic. So we said walking is what you say, it's controlled or automatic? I can't hear you. That's a disadvantage of such a large lecture theater and me always listening too loud to music. So again, please. Sorry? Automatic, yes. Okay, that's probably automatic. We don't need attention for that. However, think about when toddlers learn to walk, or if you lost a limb and you have to learn to walk again, it may be controlled. And for instance, you find exactly that in the elderly, when they have to walk and you give them a second task to do, their walking pattern becomes much more irregular and is very vulnerable to such dual task elements, and the risk of falls is rising. Another example, driving, if you're experienced, is automatic, but many of you may remember their first driving lesson, and it was probably anything but not automatic. Usually you sit there and you just say, okay, so many things to think about, and if somebody else speaks to you, just say, shut up, I have to concentrate on the road. However, the same thing for experienced drivers. If you come into a situation where it's difficult to drive, new road layout, road construction or something, or you don't know your way and you have to look for signs, then people often can't multitask anymore as well. Okay, For this brief summary, let's say that multitasking is the concurrent performance of two tasks which require attention. This requiring attention, don't consider this as a too hard prerequisite, because it can already be debated what exactly attention or automaticity is here. But it's a very good, let's say, rule of thumb. And when we do such two tasks, what we then observe is that multitasking actually results in performance decrements. That means we become slower and we make more errors. So multitasking is really nothing which is easy, but instead something where we suffer in our performance. Okay, so let's have a little demonstration here. And as a demonstration, we take something which is called the task switching paradigm, first observed or used by Gersel in 1927, so soon 100 years old. And for that, please get a piece of paper and a pen for the task. Okay, so prepare yourself. Okay, and we will do 2 rounds of that. I will put a stopwatch in a moment on the screen, and if I say ready, set, go, then please do the following. First, write the alphabet, A to Z, and then the numbers 1 to 26. So first 1 row or 2 rows of A, B, C, D, E until Z, and then you do another row where you just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until 26, and when you finish, you look up what time is on the screen, you write that down. Okay? So let me get okay, where's the start button? Let's do it like this. Okay, ready, set, go. Okay, I think most people have finished now. And now we do basically the same thing, but you may imagine what comes next. We now intermingle them. So you write A, then 1, then B, then 2, then C, then 3, until you come to Y, 25, Z, 26. Okay, wait for the stopwatch. And time yourself again. Okay, reset. Ready, set, go. Okay. So if you haven't finished yet, just write down 1:30. Okay, and now I will have to activate that. Please go to Poll Everywhere. Just wait 1 second and enter what your performance was, in which task you were faster. If it's roughly within 1 or 2 seconds, you can say it's the same. But if it's more than 1 or 2 seconds difference between the two runs, please say in which one you have been faster. Okay, let's have a look at the result. 90%, 91% said they were faster when they did separately. And these two, they are liars or pressed the wrong button or something. No. Yeah, you see there's a very strong effect on that when you have to switch between two tasks, that you slow down. And the reason why you slow down, there can be various reasons for this. In these types of tasks, the main reason is that you have some additional requirements in this task when you do multitasking, and that is, for instance, you have to keep track when you write the letter, for instance, and then go back to the number, that you have to say, okay, what number did I leave off before? Or you have to look or something. So you have higher demands on working memory, and you have to find your entry point again in the sequence. So that makes it much more difficult. And that's kind of the same thing on a larger level, like in an office task. When you left off something and you were disrupted or switched to something else, when you switch back, you have to think, okay, where have I been? And when you're reading something, you may go back a couple of lines to get into the topic again. And these things cost time. So even on the very applied area of, let's say, economy, and when you look at YouTube for tips for running your business or something, multitasking is generally discouraged. Single tasking is promoted. Okay, do you have any questions regarding this instruction? Okay, so now we really go a little bit more into cognitive psychology, and I would like to invite you to broaden your mind and the way of thinking, because cognitive psychologists have a very particular, I don't want to say peculiar, way of thinking about how the mind works and how it may be described. And in cognitive psychology, the main way how we investigate the mind, the mental processes, is by experimentation. So it's an empirical field. And a psychological experiment in general is that usually we manipulate only one parameter, our independent variable, IV, and try to leave everything else constant as much as possible. And then we have our measure, our dependent variable, and we see whether this manipulation had an effect on our dependent variable. And in cognitive psychology, in particular when we investigate multitasking, we typically look at response times as dependent variables, so how long did it take to do the task, and error rates, how many errors have been made. In other domains like memory, of course, accuracy is much more important. How many items did people remember in their memory task? So usually we do computer-based experiments. So often very boring. We present stimuli such as letters on a computer screen, and participants have to respond as quickly and accurately as they can on the keyboard. And then we get response times and error rates. And these experiments often last around 30 to 60 minutes, because you have to go through all the conditions many times so that you get stable averages of everything. Okay, so Let's suppose we do such a very easy and simple task. Then cognitive psychologists want to describe what happens in the mind in some way. And there are different ways to describe that, and the information processing approach is one of these ways, which is, again, in this area of multitasking, the most typical one to be used. So let's start with an example. Let's say we have a so-called speeded two-choice response task. What does it mean? It means basically, let's say this is the computer screen, and on the screen you just see the letter L or R. And your task is, if it says L, press the left button as quickly as possible. When it's R, press the right button as quickly as possible. It's speeded because we ask you to be as fast as possible, and you have two choices to respond. And therefore it's called speeded two-choice response task. Now we could manipulate here, introduce a manipulation, and for instance could say, well, we have one condition where if it says L, press the left finger, and if it's R, right finger, or in another condition where it says L, press the right finger, and where it says R, press the left finger. So what would you predict about the performance in condition 1 and condition 2? So where do you think people would be better? Condition 1 probably, yes, because it's a much easier and direct mapping between the stimulus and the response. L for left hand, as the other way around. So condition 2 is probably slower and people make more mistakes because they get confused. Okay, so when we want to describe now the mental processes going on in such a task, people use such a flowchart type of thing. They say, okay, the processing in our mind first starts with the perception. So we have to perceive the stimuli we see, and we have to analyze them. So it starts out when we see that, oh, there are two lines which are rectangular to each other, and then all the way up until we have the mental representation, oh, I am seeing the letter L. Then we have a processing stage which is called response selection. Here we make a decision which response is required when I see an L. And then finally we have a motor execution where we actually respond by pressing the appropriate finger. So this is one of the most simplified ways to describe what mental processes go on when we do such a simple task. It's called information processing approach because the analogy is from computer sciences. And it came up in the 1950s and 60s when cognitive psychology arose, and at the same time computers came into being, so to say. So perception is equivalent to the input into the computer system. Somehow the response selection can be best compared to the processing, where you really have calculations going on, you make decisions about something. And then motor execution in the widest sense is the output. That means you may have something put on the screen, move a robot arm or something like that. And just to show you, this is just a screenshot from a paper. This is actually how it is used in research, in publications, and so forth. So where you have perception stages and so forth. And this is from a multitasking paper, and we will see examples of that more often through the lecture. Okay, do you have any questions on that part? Good. I hope not because you have been totally lost, but instead because everything is clear. Okay, so now I would like to go into more detail, and I appreciate that this is getting a little bit challenging now. So this is the task I personally work with most, and most of my final year dissertation students use that task as well. And I do remember when I was a PhD student that it took me a while to actually really grasp the whole logic and understand it fully. But let's give it a shot. If you get lost here or there a little bit, don't worry about that. This is a bit advanced. Just try to catch up and understand the rest, even if you didn't understand one bit fully. Okay, so as I said, in cognitive psychology, the basic approach to understand things is experimentation. And when we do experiments, what we typically do is we try to simplify things as much as possible. So what we do is we have this phenomenon, let's say multitasking, and we try to break it down to make it as simple as possible. Because when we have such a simple form of that, then we have a much better control over it. So a very basic and simple multitasking situation is where we have two tasks, just two tasks, not more, and we use speeded response task, like we have seen before. And each just requires a button press in response to a stimulus. So two of these speeded two-choice forced response tasks we've just seen. And if you do that, then you have something which is called the paradigm of the psychological refractory period. And in a moment you will see where the name comes from. Okay, so how does that look like? Let's say you have two different component tasks. And the first task, let's name it the auditory task. So you have speakers or headphones, and via these speakers or headphones you hear either a ha-ha or a ya-ya. And depending on what you hear, you press either the middle finger or the index finger. Speed it as quickly and accurately as possible. Now in these type of experiments, you first do that task for a while. You go through that and you just, until you're really familiar with the task and you can do it very easily. It's a very simple task. Then you have a second task where you see a face on the screen. And now you use your right hand. If it's a male face, one finger, female face, another finger. And again, you just do it speeded. Then we use these stimuli. It's just random chance, or it has some reasons, but you actually could use just high-pitched, low-pitched beep and the number 1 or 2 or a red or blue circle or something like that. And you may imagine what comes next then, and that is we combine both to make a dual task out of that. So what participants see and hear is they get a sound and see something on the screen. So it's two different inputs, two different modalities, and then they have to respond to one with the left hand, to the other one with the right hand. So in theory, they should be able to do it in parallel, because one is auditory left hand, the other one is visual right hand. There's no obvious interference between the tasks. One key thing which is often manipulated in these studies is the so-called stimulus onset asynchrony, or abbreviated the SOA. So that's the dual task, as we have said, and so far I've said they are presented at the same time. But exactly that's one thing which often is modulated. You guys in the back, can I please ask you to be quiet? You even don't realize that I talk about you, don't you? Can you please nudge your neighbors? Can you please be quiet? I mean, you came in late, disrupted, now you're just talking. If you don't want to listen to it, just leave, please, okay? So, here I said it at the same time, but that is something which actually can be manipulated. So, in this example, when this is time, both were presented at the same time. SOA of 0 milliseconds. But we can present one after the other, let's say 100 milliseconds later or 200 milliseconds later. So we have a slight gap between the tasks. We can also switch around the order and present one before the other with a certain SOA. So this SOA manipulation becomes important in a moment. Now when we do that and plot the SOA here and the response times here, so how fast were people to respond to the task, and say, okay, this is a very short SOA, same time, and this is a longer SOA, where they are separated, then we observe a very prototypical finding, and that is that the response times for the first task you have to respond to are independent of the SOA. They're always the same. So no matter whether the second task is virtually at the same time or comes much later, it's always the same. Response time of the second task, however, they are strongly dependent on the SOA. At the long SOA, they are rather short, but when you shorten the SOA, they increase. And they increase quite profoundly. So this is a huge effect and very robust. Everybody shows that. So the PRP effect is that when we decrease the SOA, then the response times of the first task remain unaffected, while the response times of the second task increase. And this increase is so strong that it's actually a slope of -1. That means if we increase the SOA by 20 milliseconds, then the response time increases by 20 milliseconds as well. And that's where the name comes from, because it looks like a refractory period, like the action potentials in the neurons. There's a certain time before you can fire a second action potential along the axon. And here it seems as if there is a refractory period until you can respond to a second task. So how can we now explain the PRP effect? And the key explanation, there are alternatives, which we won't go into detail today, is by the assumption that we have a bottleneck, a processing bottleneck in our mind. And such a bottleneck is basically a processing stage which can process only one task at a time, which is limited to serial processing and can't process the task in parallel. So these were the processing stages we spoke about: perception, response, selection, motor execution. Now the question which research asks itself is, which of these stages constitute bottlenecks? Is it one? Is it more? Which one is it? So there are a lot of questions with that. And current state of research suggests that it's the response selection which is limited. Okay, so that is the model. At short SOA, so this is the processing of the first task. These are now these processing stages again: perception, response selection, and motor execution, or here it's RE, response execution, of the first task and of the second task. Now, if the response selection constitutes a bottleneck, that means while the response selection, this blue stage, is processing the first task, it can't process the second task. So it has to wait. And this waiting time results in the prolongation of the response time. And now it's evident why it's a slope of -1. If I change that slightly here, then I change the response time by exactly the same amount, because this stage just has to wait here until that. So if I move that bit a little bit back and forth, it doesn't do anything when this one is finished. Okay, so this assumption that the response selection is the bottleneck has been called the response selection bottleneck theory. A slightly different way to depict the same idea is to say, well, some stages, like the perception, can work in parallel, but then the information processing hits a bottleneck, and then, like motor execution, can work in parallel again. So how does the situation look like at the long SOA? Here, the second stimulus is presented so late after the first one that this processing already has finished. So there's no waiting time involved. And that's the reason why it's quite fast in the end when the SOA is long. So now, how do we know that it is the response selection bottleneck? That the response selection constitutes the bottleneck and not some other stage? And this logic, which comes now, is the deepest we will go today. It won't get any more complicated. And this has been done by something which is called the locus of slack method. And slack basically is this waiting time in the second task. Okay, let's have a look at this diagram again, which we all have seen now already. And let's suppose we introduce a manipulation in an experiment. And this manipulation makes, let's say, the perception stage of the second task more difficult. And it can be made more difficult, for instance, by just decreasing the contrast of the stimulus. So if you have a face, then you make it that it's very hard to identify. It just takes longer, so the perception stage takes more time. Now, what might happen here at the short SOA? If I make this stage more difficult, how will that affect RT2? Anybody, any idea? Well, it won't, because any prolongation is just sucked up here in this waiting time. We just have to wait a little bit less time. But the response time will be unchanged. So at a short SOA, if I manipulate the perception stage, I don't see any differences of the manipulation. At the long SOA, however, any prolongation here would move on the blue stage further to the back, and I would see a difference in response time. And that's the theoretical pattern which is observed. At a long SOA, my manipulation of the difficulty has an effect. At the short SOA, it doesn't. Yes?
Can you just explain what SOA is again?
SOA is the stimulus onset asynchrony. That means the time between the presentation of the two stimuli. So here, they are presented very close in time, or at the same time, and here, let's say one is presented half a second or a second after the other, so much longer. So that in this case, when the perception of the second stimulus has finished, the first task is already very far progressed in processing, mental processing. In particular, the response selection stage has finished already. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. So we see that effect here. So it seems if we manipulate a processing stage which is before the bottleneck, we see this under additivity. Now what happens if we manipulate a processing stage which is at or after the bottleneck? Let's say we manipulate the difficulty of the response selection so that it takes longer. An example we already have seen. We can have either a compatible mapping or an incompatible mapping. Let's say an arrow pointing to the left or right. When it points to the left, I press to the left. Easy task. When it points to the left and I have to press right, more difficult task. Response selection takes longer. Then there's nothing which can be sucked up in this slack here, so any prolongation would already also move this green box further away to the back, and response time 2 would increase. And at the same at the long SOA. So that here we do not see these under additive effects, but we see at short and long SOA the same effect of our difficulty manipulation. So what people have done is they tried all different kinds of manipulation, whatever you can do with these processing stages, and looked for these two patterns. And then they saw, oh, perception is parallel, response selection is parallel, motor execution is parallel, and that the effects of the response selection are additive, but of the perception are under additive. So they concluded that response selection is the bottleneck. Okay, any questions on that? Good. Okay, so yeah, it's basically exactly what I just said, just a summary of that. So the conclusions from that is that the perception and the motor execution do not constitute bottlenecks. They work in parallel. However, the response selection, and we just have seen 3 processing stages now. There are actually at least 7 or 8 distinct stages. So you can break down the individual stages even more. And potentially also the response initiation, so-called, do constitute bottlenecks. And they are really limited to serial processing. That means one task at a time. Now, this is an example of a method which in general is called mental chronometry. And mental chronometry means we take response times of participants to infer on the cognitive mechanisms. If you think about this, all what we have is how long does it take a person to press a key? But by very smart and fine-grained manipulations of the different conditions, we can really make detailed conclusions about, okay, these things can work in parallel in our mind and these things can work serially in our mind. So just by these behavioral methods, we actually can get a lot of insight into how our mind is working. We do not necessarily need, for these type of questions, like brain imaging studies or something like that for this. And there are actually that thick books who just deal with what to do with response times, how you can analyze them in different ways, look at distributions, what does it tell you about the underlying mental processes. So this is kind of a science in itself. So you may wonder, this PRP effect, which is so robust, whether practice can eliminate it. And this is a study. I think most of the participants in that studies were actually the authors of that study, who did these type of tasks each time for an hour or so for 36 sessions. So quite a lot of training and practice. And what you see is, so this is this amount of slowing down in the second task, that you have strong training effects. And you're slowed down really much less after training than in the beginning. However, you cannot get it away completely. There's always some residual cost. And this points to the fact that you may speed up at certain things, but you do not get rid of the bottleneck. You can't train yourself to do two things fully in parallel at that stage. And that brings me now going back to the general picture before we stop for a short break. You may now say, okay, this is all nice and well, but it's very theoretical, and we use these computerized tasks and people press buttons and it's 350 milliseconds, which is a third of a second. What is the relevance of that? And there actually is quite a bit of everyday relevance here, because first of all, everybody suffers from it. Second of all, you can't get rid of it. Third, it has been shown that it is a very omnipresent phenomenon. As soon as you have to make two decisions, you suffer from that bottleneck. And even more processes. For instance, if you retrieve information from long-term memory, that is subject to a bottleneck, to the same bottleneck as well. Now suppose you're driving a car and a control light comes up or something and you have to make a decision, oh, do I stop the car or not? That is a decision process which creates a bottleneck. So if a child steps in front of your car, your braking, before you start braking, may be slowed down by as much as half a second. If you calculate how much distance you do at 30 miles per hour in half a second, you will see that it's a couple of meters. So knowing exactly what goes on in our brain when we make any type of decision is quite important. Think about pilots or jobs like air traffic controllers. They can't miss a signal. That is really crucial here. So there is quite a bit of everyday relevance to this very theoretically looking research. Okay, let's stop for 5 to 10 minutes, brief break, and then we go on with a more light-hearted second part, which then also will turn to this idea of gender differences in multitasking. Okay, let's go on to the next part. So this PRP model, because it has these implications which I just mentioned, really elicited research of literally hundreds of papers which are out there, which tried every different combination. And there are a couple of questions which are really in the focus of this type of research. And one of the questions we just mentioned, which bottleneck stage or which stage constitutes bottlenecks. And another question a lot of people looked at is, why are some stages limited to serial processing? And there's a very fundamental divide between two views in the literature, and some people would say, well, it's basically because of strategic reasons. So in theory, we actually could process the tasks fully in parallel. That means without a bottleneck. However, we may have, when we do that, like strong interference between the tasks. Or we may actually be slower and make more errors. For instance, because of the interference, and then to deal with the interference takes longer. So that it is more efficient to process the tasks serially. And because of that, we just do it that way. We use our system. And there are some papers who try to mathematically model the performance and have like computer simulations, which if you make certain assumptions, that actually is the case. That it would be more efficient to do one after the other, even if you construct a system which could do it in parallel. So there is some merit to this idea that it may be a strategic decision. However, some other people would say, well, it's a structural limitation. It's really hardwired that way in our brain, so we can't avoid it. So the bottleneck is immutable. And then you have really these kind of, in quotation mark, fights in the literature with groups of one view publishing a paper, and they termed it virtually perfect time sharing and dual task performance, uncorking the central cognitive bottleneck. And then 2 years later, the other group replies to that, is dual task slowing instruction dependent, and questions that again. So it's going a bit back and forth, and at the moment nobody really knows the answer to that. Okay, so now another question is, what are the consequences of such a bottleneck? So just say we have it, no matter whether it's structural or immutable, but it is there in our task processing. Do we need additional executive control? And executive functions or executive control means mental processes which are, when you say it's a hierarchy, higher up in the hierarchy and coordinate lower level processes. They are like the CEO of a company, the central executive officer, who makes sure everything else is running the way it should run. And to be honest, most PRP researchers really don't mind, they don't look at that question. Some argue, no, it's fully passive. First come, first served. That information or task which first arrives at the bottleneck is processed first by the bottleneck. And others argue, yes, you do need additional executive functions. And that actually is one of my main research interests, and I would put myself here. I strongly believe that we do need additional executive functions to do that. So when we look again at this schematic illustration of the bottleneck, then what could these additional functions be? It could be, for instance, switching the bottleneck between tasks. So if in this very mechanistic drawing, you say you have this lever here, which controls access to the bottleneck, after the first task has been processed, it needs to be switched so that the other task has processed, needs to be switched back for the next trial, and so forth. We have to explicitly sequence and order task processing, because in these tasks, participants are usually instructed, please respond first to this one task or the other task. people say, well, when we process the first task, we have to actively inhibit the second task so that it doesn't push itself into the bottleneck, causes interference, and makes trouble. And we have to monitor that everything goes to plan. And these things, switching, sequencing, inhibition, monitoring, are very, very prototypical and classical executive functions, executive control processes. So there are quite a few reasons to believe that these PRP tasks actually do need additional executive functions. So how could one test for it? And there is a variety of approaches. One approach I'm using is using functional brain imaging. And what we see is, in a, let's say, very simplified form, you have some brain areas working on first task, some other brain areas working on the second task, and if you put them together, then you suddenly get additional brain areas which are not related to either of the two tasks, which are then active only in the dual task. And these additional brain areas are localized in the so-called lateral prefrontal cortex, which has been associated, surprise, surprise, with executive functions. So that all makes perfectly good sense. Another line of research is that it is known that certain populations have impaired executive functions, or you can impair them by certain things like caffeine or so. And this type of research is mainly run by final year dissertation projects. So what we do is we compare two groups, for instance, dyslexics versus non-dyslexics, or highly neurotics with low neurotics. That was a PhD work. Or smokers who are on nicotine deprivation as compared to smokers who just had a cigarette. There are also certain populations which are known to have higher than average executive functions. For instance, bilinguals. They are known to be quite good because they have a very high training in switching between the languages and inhibiting the language they are currently not using. Or video game players. Has been thought that there's a lot of training if you do a lot of first-person shooter gaming in your mental system. Now the logic is that if PRP tasks really rely on executive functions, then there should be a difference between the groups. So if people are known to have lower than average executive functions, they should also be worse in these dual tasks. And if they are better in executive functions, they should also be better at the PRP task. And what we are looking at is typically this type of interaction. We are looking for effects which are specific to the dual task. So when we have here response times, and here the response times, so this is a schematic illustration, in the single task performance. So when you do either task alone for itself, the two groups often actually don't differ, which we compare. However, in the dual task, if they do both together, we see everybody has costs. Everybody gets slower and makes more mistakes. However, some people suffer more than other people. And if PRP tasks do rely on executive functions, then those known with poor executive functions should be here. And those which are known to have better ones should be here. And the research which we gathered so far now from quite a lot of different groups, these were just examples, are in support of this hypothesis. Typically, we always find that dyslexics, highly neurotic people, or deprived smokers, they all show higher dual task costs. And this is an example of real data now from the high neurotics and low neurotic people, for instance. You can see this interaction, the costs are higher here. Now, this year, I first had a student looking at the effects of cannabis on that. And I recently had two other students in my office, final year dissertation students, and they were looking at caffeine. They were saying, oh yeah, caffeine should be fine to get ethical approval because we have heard some other people are using cannabis. They're giving cannabis to the participants. They can smoke weed in the experiments. And I said, are you sure? do you by any chance know the name of the students? And they said the name, and I was like, that is my student. So directly after the meeting, I contacted him to make sure that he did not actually give them cannabis in the study, which, as discussed before, of course he didn't. We are only looking at people who say from themselves that they smoke weed at least twice a week. So they're by no means like high users, no extreme users. And when we test them, they are not acutely intoxicated or so. They usually had their last joint like at least 1 or 2 days ago. However, I've never seen a group which had such a huge effect than cannabis. So dyslexics or neuroticism. We looked at the effects of music, computer gaming, bilingualism. They all show effects, but all roughly half the size of what cannabis is doing. So you become much slower, specifically in multitasking, if you more or less frequently smoke weed. To make that a bit more relative, you may know that the active ingredient, THC, stays in your body very long. So what we are measuring here are probably still effects of the acute effects of the drug in the system. You would have to have at least a month of abstinence to say, okay, these are now long-term effects due to changes, permanent changes to your system. And there it has been shown that cannabis only has, in some domains, some long-lasting changes even after you have stopped. I think time perception is one, which makes some sense here. Okay, so do you have any questions on this PRP model? Yes?
You said people who are bilingual have faster executive function, but if it's a dyslexic who is bilingual?
So, yeah, possibly the effects may at least partially cancel each other out, so that in the end you may be perfectly on the average of a non-dyslexic monolingual person. So. Any other questions? Yes?
I was just curious, because some people, they've got disorders which create them to have like sensory overloads.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, is it connected to like this bottleneck theory that they can't take in?
Well, as far as we know, the perception, which would probably most closely link to the sensory overloads, can in principle work in parallel. However, what has been shown is that, for instance, in the elderly, when you present very salient stimuli, so which are very dominant and attract your attention, that they are very confused by that and they bring trouble to the whole processing. And I would say this is then a particular, they may affect your measurements, but it's not really affecting this bottleneck in itself. So it may disguise that in a certain way, but I would say that this bottleneck probably is independent of these type of things. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so let's finish off with gender effects in multitasking, and I would like to ask you, I will activate that poll, to fill out a couple of questions on your views in, it's now a series of 5 questions, what you think about gender differences in multitasking. Oh no, I don't want to fill it out. let's have a look at some of the key responses. So, do you believe that there are gender differences in multitasking ability? 79% say yes and 21% say no. Okay. If you believe, who do you think is better? 5% are in favor of males, 68% are in favor of females. The females are better. Okay. This one is particularly interesting for myself to get further ideas. So, females have more responsibility in general and are more used to doing more than one thing at a time, especially when it comes to the home. Females have been nurtured to be better than males at multitasking. Females are better because of cognitive differences. Females have greater responsibilities. The environment that women spend most of their time, that means home, supermarket, schools. Again, no. Because females require multitasking more, for example, when they have children. Men also take care of the children, but maybe it's like genetic or something. Females use a different side of their brain more than males. Okay, so let's have a look. Oh yeah, and I have one little YouTube video which looks at this again. It's a bit silly, but it again illustrates some of the things we want to make.
When it came to the Battle of the Sexes round 2, Carrie, Grant, and Tori wanted to know if women were the master multitaskers.
Mommy, what's the time to go to school?
To find out, they set up an elaborate multitasking test and pitted 10 guys against 10 girls.
Shoes, phone, saves the baby.
But a competitive streak of a mile wide meant they couldn't resist taking a turn themselves.
Good luck. Really? Really?
Grant went first, and he was off to a lightning start.
I get up every morning.
The goal of the test is to manage a myriad of chores simultaneously in less than 5 minutes. While eating, getting ready, minding baby mustard, he also has to answer the phone.
Sacramento.
And Grant, representing for Team Guy, does an awesome job in record time.
Brent did us men proud. He completed all the tasks and got out the door. See how fair.
Grant clearly thinks Carrie can't touch his sword. Let's see how she does. And how she does is nothing short of a stunt. In a blur of action, she completes each task in the perfect order.
Oh my gosh.
Keeps baby Buster safe, prepares lunch and breakfast, and
She's like a lightning storm. Wait, wow, are you kidding?
kicks some serious butt.
She didn't even make a second phone call. Wait a minute, he's done? Yeah, I think. Oh my god, with 2 minutes to go, wow!
Okay. When you looked at that video, obviously this is not a proper scientific study, but I think they used the setup if you just use single cases. There was one thing which I found interesting, well, that's the reason why I showed that. The man looked much more hectic, and the woman looked much more calmer and relaxed here. And maybe there's something to that, but I come to that in the end. Okay, so back to the questionnaire. Are there gender differences? Who's better? And 3 years ago, I was approached by these two students, and they said, okay, we want to do a questionnaire study. And I myself always did only these like computerized tasks and said, well, I'm not an expert in it, but if you want to, let's do that. And they did it, and we found it so interesting that we got 2 PhD students on board as well to run the study in different countries, and then we're able even to publish that. So these are the data from this, what I showed initially. So these are the percentages of people who thinks there are gender differences. And we had cohorts from the UK. US was a very small sample, I think only 50 people, Germany, Netherlands, Turkey, and then just other people from around the world. And what you can see that, except for the US, in most countries, more than 50% believe that there are actually gender differences. And this questionnaire was a little bit smarter than the one you have seen on your phone. Only the ones who said yes to gender differences then got the question, who do you think is better, men or women? And these are the percentages who think women are better than men at multitasking. And split for females and males. And you see there's a slight tendency that females think women are better, which is a little bit natural, and that overall it's really a strong effect, and even most men on average think that women are better. There was only one exception, and that was Turkey, where it's below 50% of men think women are better. In other words, Turkey is the only country where the majority of men thinks men are better at multitasking. In all other samples, for the US, we just didn't have enough males who answer that question. So the point of that study was that there really is a very strong stereotype out there that women are better at multitasking than men. Then we asked the question, why are women better, like we did to you, but we first asked explicitly whether it's possibly because of the demands of household and childcare that women have more practice in that. And again, a lot of answers. So the axis here is that people say, well, women are better at multitasking because of these demands of the child care, and we have quite a high proportion of people agreeing to that. Interestingly, again, a kind of outlier finding, the Dutch males totally do not agree to that. So maybe they want to say, well, no, that is a cliche or something like that, although the Dutch females actually do agree to that quite strongly, like most other people. Okay, so people think women are better at multitasking in general. So how did they rate themselves? So we asked everybody, okay, on a scale between, I can't remember, 1 and 9, how good do you think you are at multitasking? And then interestingly, overall, I mean, it's self-rated, not the actual, it really doesn't matter much. So in some countries, like the UK, you find a difference, and Germany as well. But generally, if you average across all, people actually, or if you ask them, the genders don't assign themselves a difference here. What is kind of interesting and funny is that if you look, virtually everybody, the mean is above 3, which was the average of the scale. So, you know, it's along the lines, 75% of the people think that they are better than the average, which naturally, of course, can't be the case. Okay, so this was about stereotypes and about self-rated abilities. What does science tell us when we look at cognitive psychology in particular, at these tasks, like the PRP task or the task switching? Then we can conclude usually there are no gender differences in multitasking abilities. And if there are gender differences, because sometimes they have been reported, then they are very small. So these studies then often have very large samples, sometimes 150 or 200 people, and then they just get it significant. So in practical terms, it's very unlikely that you see any effect or relevance or everyday relevance to that. And in addition, they appear to be random. Some studies find that females are better, some find that males are better. So from a scientific basis, there's really no reason to assume. And then the question really is, why is there the general perception in the public, the stereotype that women are so much better than men? And this actually is not known at the moment. One thing is, stereotypes can arise without any underlying truth to them. So they can be purely belief. However, often they are based on some true underlying thing which you can find on the population. So it might be that we so far looked at the wrong tasks or measures. In these studies, there are some which come from an applied context. So for instance, where they had office tasks, doing two things. Some come from more driving-like situations, and they also didn't find anything. They also looked at what if you give people the choice to do a certain task as multitask or as individual single task. And also in this preference to multitask, men and women seem to not differ. However, maybe there are other things which we just haven't thought about, which are even more related to everyday life, where women indeed are better than men. And the second thing is, maybe we didn't look at the right measures. And that's one reason why I showed this video clip. The woman was much calmer. She was also faster. But maybe in real life, we don't find differences between speed or accuracy, but just in the stress level of the participants or how they appear to others. And we will start here at Brunel research this summer, which actually looks exactly at this to find that out. And finally, maybe the public and scientists have a very different definition in what they think about of multitasking, although this study showed that it's actually not that different. Okay, do you have any questions on that? Yes?
It's not a question, it's just a comment. I think the woman would have been more comfortable in that environment than the man. She was more likely to have had a child and running around in the house, whereas, you know, if you'd put her in a man environment, she probably would have been the one getting stressed.
Well, possibly. From this video, I took that this is based on a real proper study. And I would hope that the authors controlled for that in terms of that they didn't compare, let's say, experienced mothers with men who don't have children, but for instance, all their participants didn't have children yet, or something like that. Or that they compared women who took regularly care of their children and then men who did take care of their children to the same amount. Because, of course, there's a certain level of practice to that. So if you have to take care of the children every morning and do the school run, you have benefits in these tasks because each individual task is easier to you. While as a man, you may not be that practiced. So, but if you take a less applied setting and make it really well controlled, then you typically don't find differences. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then we are done for today. Thanks a lot. I think your first assignment is due on Monday, as far as I understood. Check the time, I think it's 12 noon. And if I can really give you an advice, it's a computerized system. It will notice whether you submit at 12 or 12:01. So, and you know, computers do fail. So do not try to submit at L11:59. Appreciate that, and best thing, submit on Sunday or something like that, or at least 1 or 2 hours before the deadline. Because you will be marked down quite harshly if you are just a little bit late. Okay, just as a little recommendation. Have a nice weekend, and hopefully see many of you then next year for the cognitive psychology lecture.